Max, thank you so much for being here. It's been great to get to know you over the last few months. You've had this really interesting and textured career. You've been an engineer, product leader, founder, executive, CEO now. You've worked on a number of incredible companies: SteelBrick, Salesforce. Can you now Prodly? Can you just tell us a little bit about your journey and the steps along the way?
Yeah, sure. Well, thanks for having me, Finn. Certainly enjoyed our interactions as well. I'm glad to be here, and thank you for having me as a guest on your podcast. So look, my journey. I mean, really, I think that if I look at like my career and the journey across those companies that you've mentioned, and obviously the highlight has been founding and building SteelBrick. The mission really is kind of really the same, and my passion is the same. It's like, how do we make enterprise software, business software faster and easier to implement and maintain? And, when I look at what we did at CPQ and Steelbreak, right, it was kind of democratize the CPQ category by doing the very same thing. Like, I didn't invent CPQ. People do think I did, but I didn't. It actually existed as a category for many, many years, in fact, decades. But the big problem with it was that it was really, really difficult, really complicated, required a lot of, customizations and therefore can only be afforded by only the biggest companies. And we really changed all of that, right? And we did that by building on Salesforce platform, but that was more of a means to an end, right? Really, the goal was to make CPQ low code, or declaratively configured, or low code as we say now. And of course, Salesforce was a great platform to do that on. And so what we're doing at Prodly now is really just continuing kind of pulling on that thread, and our mission is to do this to the rest of SaaS. And we saw the problem, as many, like, often happens, right? Is you see problems in your personal experience, and like the idea for Prodly was born out of the massive pain that we had at Steelbrick with deploying CPQ projects between environments, from test environment that Salesforce calls the sandbox to productions. Literally took our most experienced solution architect the entire weekend to painstakingly deploy all that configuration data that powers CPQ, right, spread across dozens of different tables, objects, as Salesforce calls them. And it was just a massive problem. And it had to be our most experienced solution architect, right, because there's a lot of complexity and nuances in the data model. So you really had to understand the data model well, and all the interdependencies to be able to do this. It's not something you could just turn over to an intern, or somebody offshore. So that's how I'll probably start.
That's awesome. Yeah, I think it reminds me of just like how many businesses get started by simply trying to remove friction from a customer's experience. But you've already mentioned kind of something that like you're passionate about. But can you talk about trends or inflections that you've either lived through or are living through that are really top of mind for you, that you're really paying attention to as you build Prodly?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, I think just move to the cloud, right? The whole SaaS was, a major inflection point. I think that enabled a lot of, a lot of technologies and kind of like the fundamental underpinnings. So what needs to happen to make business software, easier to use, right? So kind of when you think about low code, no code systems, right? Like that's only made possible really by the cloud, by a large degree. And I think another inflection point that's coming, maybe it's already here, is obviously AI. I don't have a good sense yet of what that's going to do, and I think it may be a little bit too early. But obviously, when I think about what does it take to run a business system, what does it take to implement it, what does it take to maintain it, right? Like a lot of that, a lot of the kind of solutioning and architecting skill set, I think AI is probably far from achieving, but a lot of that kind of more mundane, hands on the keyboard, configuration aspects of it, that probably can, right, accelerate and if not take over completely. So I think there's a big step function in terms of efficiency that's coming.
Very good. What about the way companies are monetizing?
You mean their products?
Yeah. Do you notice any big
Yeah, I mean,
changes in the way
I do
companies are
see.
monetizing?
Yeah, I mean, you see this like certainly over the past, few years, like the been explosion in interest around usage-based pricing and these more dynamic pricing models, right? And so kind of traditionally SaaS has been, really enterprise software, certainly like on-prem has been, right, very much user-based, right, seed-based kind of licenses. And with sort of in SaaS, I think originally started with that for the most part, but certainly you're seeing a lot of SaaS leaders, a lot of SaaS startups experimenting with these more flexible, more dynamic pricing model, and it's really exciting to see all the innovation that's going on there. We actually, interestingly enough, we did try to sort of at Prodly we started with sort of a variance of a usage-based pricing model, and it didn't work for us. But it doesn't mean that it's a bad idea, right? But just I think as with everything, right? There's not a one size that fits all, so you really have to. I certainly encourage everyone to play around with usage based, and if it works for your business, it's certainly a great model that certain kind of customers like.
Can you go deeper into Prodly? What are the problems? What are the specific problems that you want Prodly to solve over the next year or two, over the next 5 years?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, we started with solving this very specific problem of reducing friction, as you said, of streamlining deployments of CPU configurations, Salesforce CPU configurations between Salesforce environments. I have this running joke that my second company, I'm solving the problem I created with my first. And what I mean by that is, a byproduct, a side effect of making CPQ declaratively configured low code and building it on Salesforce platform. A lot of the configuration had moved from metadata, like code and scripts, into data, right? You configure CPQ, and there's lots of other applications on Salesforce platform that follow the same model. You configure CPQ largely by creating records of data, right? But these records of data are, really they're data, but they really are like metadata, right? They're so consequential. And so the challenge there is like, it's not about the volume, right? But it's about the complexity. It's about all the relationships. And it's about the consequence of making a mistake and deploying those records of data. And so that's where the automation is really important, right? Because obviously it's a major productivity driver, but also it is a major driver of quality and risk reduction, and ultimately it's about driving business agility, right? Like, so when I kind of zoom out a little bit from this, and this kind of ties to our mission, right? It's like, why do we want to make business software faster and easier to deploy, to implement and maintain? Well, because if it's too hard, it takes too long. And if it takes too long to make changes, you're not as agile as you can be. And that's a big problem in today's world. Like when Salesforce and everybody else talks about digital transformations, right? Well, a core tenet of that is being responsive to the market changes, responsive to customers. And, how responsive can you be if it takes you 6 months, right, to make a change to your business system?
So well
That's
put.
The ultimate goal is to drive business agility, to accelerate digital transformations.
Yeah, it's so well put. And the points are also really well made on the consequences. Maybe you kind of speak to those consequences a little bit. I mean, the customer experience here is sort of at the center of things.
That's right. That's right.
What are some of those consequences that probably helps your customers avoid?
Oh, well, I mean, think about, again, like use CPQ, as a prime example. This also exists, in other categories. But think about making a pricing change, right? And making an error on this, right? Like, and this is the big difference between the configuration data, like our master data, and transactional data. You screw up an order. Well, you screwed up an order, right? That's one transaction, and maybe it's a big order, hopefully not, right? But it's one transaction, it's one customer. You screw up a change to a product catalog, you can bring down your business, right? Or you can have massive consequences, because every transaction that's getting created, every quote, every order that's getting created when that master data is wrong is going to be wrong. So just the compounding effect is massive, right? And then same is true, in other categories. You think about field service, let's say, right? Like you make a mistake in a scheduling rule, like now all of a sudden your trucks are rolling in the wrong directions and service equipment is getting screwed up, right? And it's a mess. And I can keep going here, right? But you get the idea.
I get the idea. It feels to me, and I wonder if you agree with this, that the broader quote to cash stack is going through a lot of change. Do you think that that's right?
Yeah, I think it is. And, it is kind of driven by what we talked about before, which is experimentation with different pricing models and, like this realignment between the front office and the back office, right? Like you kind of traditionally had your ERPs, the SAPs, the Oracles of the world, right? The Microsoft Dynamics to a lesser degree. You had your front office CRM systems, right? But I think what people are starting to realize, right, there's a lot of integration, there's a lot of independencies between the two. And, in the physical world of like shipping widgets, right, it was fairly simple, right? You have your front office system, CRM, where you keep track of your customers, you create quotes, you quote them, you place orders go into ERP, you ship the widgets, you're done. Now, fast forward to today, where you have some cases a combination of the widgets and subscriptions, or maybe it's purely subscriptions, and subscriptions could be fixed price per seat, they could be usage based, there's like changes being done, right? Like there's contracts, annual contracts, maybe no contracts, right? If you have annual contracts, changes being made to contracts. So there's a lot of complexity and there's a lot of interdependence, and it's no longer like this clean straight line from front to the back, right? And I think that's what's driving a lot of this realignment is folks are like trying to figure out what's the right mix, like where do I put things, right? Like what this process is best in front office, back office, middle office, right? Like where does it go and how should it all fit together?
I want to see if you think another thing is correct or if it's missing something. Everything you just said sort of stems back to complexity that I've been trying to organize in my own mind. What are the kind of core pillars of complexity that modern B2B SaaS businesses are having to support? And I've started to describe them to myself as you've got to find a way to support multiple go-to-market motions. You have to find a way to support multiple and or hybrid billing models, and you of course have to support multiple products if the business is scaling. And I wonder if you think those are the right three pillars for operators to really kind of wrap their minds around, or if you think there's a fourth or a fifth, or if you think about it and frame it differently.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's right. It just all depends on how, of course, you want to get, but yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, right, it's go to market and it's product, right? So those are the two big buckets that you have to play with. And, I think in my mind, certainly I like the pricing models and a lot of this experimentation with different, dynamic pricing models, usage, etc. I mean, I would put this under the rubric of go to market for sure.
Got it. Yeah. Well, supporting this type of complexity, or the complexity that we've been talking about, ends up being governed by multiple systems.
Right.
And so I'm curious, kind of, if you were talking to other product leaders, other engineering leaders, other CEOs, and you were kind of describing how you've thought about architecting these systems internally at Prodly, could you shed some light on how you've built your own stack?
Yeah, so we're obviously a Salesforce partner, and Salesforce is at the core of our tech stack. We use certainly obviously Salesforce for CRM. We use Salesforce for service. We also use Salesforce for marketing automation. Pardot is the product that Salesforce acquired through Exact Target acquisition, right? Part of the marketing cloud. We use that, and then we kind of augment this with kind of a more modern, maybe like platforms or specialized platforms like Gong. We actually kind of standardized on Gong as our revenue intelligence, but also for sales engagement.
Interesting.
We have a new product that's, I mean, frankly, it's a little bit immature, but kind of like competitor to Outreach slash Salesloft, right? But it works for us. I mean, at our scale, it's fine. So look, I'm a big fan of like tech stack consolidation, and like the fewer platforms you have, the better. But I think really the important thing is certainly when you think about like a customer experience, right? What is it? What is the experience of buying and a product and making changes? And when I say buying, not just the initial purchase, right, but also buying add-ons and renewing, right, and making amendments to your contract. What does that look like, right? And you really want to make sure that that's a streamlined, cohesive experience for your customers. And in order to do that, you probably need to make sure that like whatever goes into that for you is, really fits well together, which, may mean it's on the same platform, likely does, but, you can not necessarily, but likely does, right? And just like it makes it a lot easier if it is, right? So, a classic example I run into all the time, right, is, doesn't make sense like quota cash, like how did quota cash come into being, right? But a lot of it came from the realization, right? It's really hard to kind of stitch together different systems. Like if you have one system that does quoting, CPQ, another system that does, subscription billing, like contract, right? Who owns the contract, right? Both sides need to talk to that. They need to generate, they need to amend. So like, can you make it work? Sure, but it's really, really, really hard, right? If it lives in different systems. So like that's obviously why there's quote to cash and why Salesforce got into billing, right? And all these other players are trying to kind of come up with their own stack to do that. So not everything has to be on the same platform, right? Not everything can be on the same platform, but I think you really want to think through kind of along these pillars, right? Pricing and like buying experience, provisioning experience is another, right? Like something I know you're working on, right? Like does that have to be the same platform? Probably not. But there you probably want to be tightly integrated into the whatever tech stack the product runs on, right? Because that's the lever, right? That's the driver of efficiency there.
One thing that I'm really interested to talk about is maybe just the relationship between pricing and packaging and the downstream business tools, but also your product. How do you think about kind of pricing and its relationship to the product, but also its relationship to the downstream business systems that might be sources of truth for a CRO or sources of truth for a CFO?
Yeah, it's pricing and packaging, or P&P, or as it's commonly called, is really interesting, right? Because there's so many dimensions to it, right? There's the commercial, like the obvious commercial dimension to it. How much revenue are you getting or not getting, right? It also signals something about your brand and the product value, right? Like Salesforce's price is a premium product, for example, right? There's good reasons for it, right? But that's a signaling that occurs. And then it also obviously integrates very tightly with your product, right? So like the packaging part of it, obviously, right? Not the pricing. So yeah, I think it's just really interesting. Like it's like at the center of it all. Like when we talk about these two big pillars, right? Go to market and product, it's kind of right there in the middle, and touches everything, right? As well as the back office, which we didn't really talk about, right? But it's kind of at the center.
I run into a lot of companies where they might be trying to support like a self-serve motion. So they're billing through like a Stripe, and then they might be supporting a direct sales motion. So they've got, Salesforce as the CRM, for example, and maybe they're using a CPQ product as well. And then as they grow, they might even layer on like a NetSuite. And so now there's like NetSuite for, what is initially perceived to be like gap accounting, but they actually end up trying to use it for billing as well. And so to your earlier point, like you have product catalogs and contracts in multiple systems, each of which represents a source of truth for a different executive in the business. And it just gets incredibly painful to reconcile.
Yeah.
And I wonder if, having seen that and felt that, how do you think about avoiding that type of complexity as you build Prodly?
Well, so, I think it goes a little bit to what I'm talking about, like tech stack consolidation, right, and making sure you don't have the disparate systems. But look, it's a hard problem to solve. There's a term for it called omni-channel, right? And so I know like Salesforce certainly thinking a lot about it, and like the new product that they're working on launching on now, called revenue lifecycle management, is certainly, that's a foundational premise to the product vision, is being omnichannel, right? No matter how you transact, whether it's through direct sales force, or through partners, or through self-service on the website, right? It all comes from the same product catalog, the same pricing, goes through the same billing engine. I mean, for us, like at Prodly specifically, it's not a huge issue because we tend to work with larger customers, and it's like we're very heavily sort of direct. We have partnerships, and kind of a healthy channel practice, but it's really more around kind of sourcing opportunities and lead gen. Like we don't really sell through channel per se. So it's not like a huge concern for us, but I know it's definitely like a big topic in the industry, and a lot of innovation is going into that. Certainly, like at Salesforce, I know that for a fact.
One thing that I feel like operators, and maybe more specifically founders, are maybe increasingly aware of is the importance of willingness to pay in the early stages. In my first company, I felt like that was one of my biggest weaknesses, and I've tried to address that heavily in this second business. I'm curious how you've approached understanding willingness to pay as you've built Prodly.
You mean willingness of your customers?
Yeah, willingness of your customers to pay.
Again.
Like literally, how have you approached trying to understand their willingness to pay, and
how much they're willing to pay?
Yeah, like how have you, like what have been like the operating procedures or techniques that you've used to try to understand the market's willingness to pay for your.
So I mean, look, being willing to pay is obviously like the only thing that matters, right? Like that's
the only thing, right?
That's the true arbiter of value, right? Like people say anything they want, right? But unless they're willing to pay for your product, like you probably aren't creating enough value for providing enough value, right? Let's just be clear. And then like how much? Look, I mean, I don't know if there's I mean, in my mind anyway, in my experience, it just comes to experimentation. We probably on our third or fourth iteration of a pricing model at Prodly, right? And like you have a hypothesis, and it's like, all right, well, let's try that, right? And you try it, and it doesn't work, or maybe there's some like unintended consequences, and you make a change again. Like obviously, you don't want to be doing this every day, right, or every month, even, right? Like there's probably such a thing as like pricing model change fatigue, right, on the part of customers and your team as well. So I mean, yeah, I would say like experimentation is probably the only way to do it. But I also, I think the other dimension to it is sort of the stage of the company. Like, I don't know if you really want to be optimizing for extracting the most money from your customers early on. I think the juice is not worth the squeeze early on, right? So there's so much opportunity, like hopefully you're in a big market, right? And like I would focus my energies on building the product to capture more of the market and like deliver the value, and then trying to like squeeze like an extra 5% from, any given deal, or any given customer.
Yeah.
Especially customers, right? Because like you want to reward them for being early on and taking a bet on you, and like, there's a lot of risk for buying, an early stage startup solution, right? And so like and also just like when you look at the numbers, right? Like by definition, right, the early customers, there's not that many of them, right? So like the opportunity just isn't there, right? And that's what I mean by the juice is not worth the squeeze. You just aren't going to get a whole much more revenue when you're early stage from optimizing, certainly existing customers, and probably new deals given the volume. When you're a mature like late stage startup or mature company, I mean that's a different story.
Yeah, I totally agree. It's like at the early stage, you're trying to optimize for something different, which is like early customers and oxygen in the product,
Yeah, exactly.
and usage.
Energy, oxygen, energy, velocity.
Yeah. Max, this has been so much fun. Where can people learn more about you and more about Prodly?
So I'm LinkedIn, Max Rudman, Prodly. Salesforce, Jailbreak, any one of those will probably pull me up. And then Prodly is at prodly.co, not .com, .co. So come hit me up on LinkedIn or reach out on the website. And if you have a problem that we solve, and if you're in the Salesforce ecosystem, chances are I'll see you around the ecosystem at the physical events that Salesforce puts on. We'll be sponsoring London World Tour in London next month, and then Hunter Dreamforce in September.
Excellent. Well, this has been so much fun. Thank you so much again.